The evening sun cast long shadows across the busy streets of downtown as Thomas Johnson maneuvered his yellow taxi through the rush-hour traffic. After 15 years behind the wheel, he'd developed an almost sixth sense for navigating the city's maze-like streets, but tonight felt different. There was an unusual tension in the air that made his weathered hands grip the steering wheel just a little tighter. At 55, Thomas had the kind of face that told stories without saying a word. Deep laugh lines around his eyes spoke of joy, while the slight furrow in his brow hinted at hardships overcome. His salt and pepper hair and warm brown eyes gave him a trustworthy appearance that put his passengers at ease. But beneath that gentle exterior lay a past that few would ever suspect. The dispatch radio crackled to life, breaking through the soft jazz playing in his cab. A pickup request came through for the industrial district, an area Thomas usually avoided after dark. Something in his gut told him to decline, but when he heard it was from the old factory district where his late wife used to work, nostalgia got the better of him. "Dispatch, this is Unit 247. "I'll take that pickup," Thomas responded, already changing lanes to head east. As he drove, memories of better days flooded back, weekend picnics with his wife near those very factories, back when the area was still thriving with honest work and hopeful futures. The street lights grew dimmer as he turned onto Morrison Street, where abandoned warehouses loomed like sleeping giants. Thomas slowed the taxi, scanning the numbers on the buildings until he spotted 3 young men standing under a flickering lamp post. They couldn't have been more than 25, wearing expensive sneakers that seemed out of place in this rundown neighborhood. As they piled into his taxi, Thomas caught a whiff of expensive cologne mixed with something else, an undercurrent of aggression that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The tallest one, wearing a designer jacket, sat directly behind him. "Where to, gentlemen?" Thomas asked, keeping his voice steady and professional. "Just drive," the one behind him commanded. "We'll tell you where to turn." Thomas met their eyes in the rearview mirror, noting how they avoided his gaze. In his years of driving, he'd learned to read people like books. These 3 were trouble, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. "Take the next right," the one by the window ordered, pulling out his phone. Thomas complied, carefully observing their reflections. They were exchanging glances, having a silent conversation that spoke volumes about their intentions. The streets became increasingly unfamiliar as they directed him deeper into the industrial zone. The city lights faded behind them, leaving only the dim glow of his headlights to illuminate the path ahead. Thomas knew these weren't ordinary passengers looking for a ride, they were hunting for an easy target, and they thought they'd found one in an aging taxi driver. What they didn't know was that before Thomas Johnson became a taxi driver, he'd spent 20 years in places where survival depended on more than just quick thinking. His passengers saw gray hair and crow's feet, but they missed the calculated way he checked his mirrors, how he noted every possible exit route, and the way his shoulders remained relaxed even as tension filled the cab. "Pull over here," the tall one commanded as they approached an abandoned loading dock. Thomas slowed the taxi but didn't completely stop, his mind already racing through scenarios and solutions. "That'll be $37, he said calmly, acting as if this was just another fare on just another night. The young man behind him laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the confined space. "I don't think you understand the situation, old man." There was a metallic click that Thomas recognized instantly. "We're not here to pay you." Thomas's expression remained unchanged, but his mind flashed back to another dark night, years ago, when he'd faced much worse odds. He'd been younger then, wearing a different uniform, but the principles remained the same: assess, adapt, and overcome. "Actually," Thomas replied, his voice taking on a depth that made his passengers pause, "I don't think you gentlemen understand the situation at all." His hands remained steady on the wheel as he prepared for what would come next. The young men exchanged confused looks, thrown off by their target's unusual calm. The one with the weapon leaned forward, trying to reassert control through intimidation. "Listen, Grandpa, just hand over everything you've got, and maybe we'll let you walk home tonight." Thomas allowed himself a small smile, not one of fear or submission, but the kind of smile that should have warned them. It was the same smile he'd worn on countless missions when opponents had underestimated him, back when his job involved much more than navigating city streets. The tension in the taxi reached a breaking point as the city continued to sleep around them, unaware of the drama unfolding in one yellow cab on a forgotten street. Thunder rumbled in the distance, promising a storm that would match the one brewing inside the vehicle. What happened next would remind these young men that appearances can be deceiving, and that some of the most dangerous people in the world are the ones who have nothing left to prove. Thomas Johnson was about to teach them a lesson they'd never forget, if they were lucky enough to learn from it. The night was far from over, and Thomas's secret past was about to become very relevant indeed. The first drops of rain began to hit the windshield as Thomas made his decision. 20 years of Special Forces training had taught him that the best way to handle a situation was to control it from the start. He'd spent those years in the shadows, conducting operations that never made the headlines but had shaped the course of conflicts around the world. "Before this goes any further," Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that comes only from experience, "I want you to look at something." He slowly reached toward the glove compartment, making sure they could see his movements. "Don't try anything stupid," the tall one warned, pressing his weapon closer. Thomas chuckled softly, the sound carrying no humor but plenty of confidence. "Son, if I wanted to try something stupid, you'd already be regretting it." He opened the glove compartment and pulled out a small leather wallet, letting it fall open to reveal a combat medallion and military ID. The young men leaned forward despite themselves, their eyes widening as they read the credentials. The rain was falling harder now, drumming against the roof of the taxi like distant artillery fire, a sound Thomas knew all too well. "That's from another life," Thomas continued, his voice steady and calm. "A life where I specialized in getting good men out of bad situations. But it also taught me how to handle people who make poor choices." He looked each of them in the eye through the rearview mirror. "Right now, you're making a very poor choice." The young man by the window shifted uncomfortably, his designer sneakers suddenly seeming less important. "Hey, listen, maybe we should." "Shut up," the tall one snapped, but his voice had lost some of its edge. The weapon in his hand trembled slightly, the kind of tremor Thomas had seen countless times in young recruits facing their first real test. "You've got about 10 seconds to make a decision," Thomas said, his tone unchanged. Option 1. You get out of my taxi, go home, and seriously reconsider your life choices. Option 2. He let the sentence hang in the air, his implications clear without needing to voice them. The third young man, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Look at his hands, man." His voice was barely a whisper, but in the confined space of the taxi, everyone heard him. Thomas's hands were still on the steering wheel, relaxed but ready, the hands of someone who knew exactly how to use them. A police siren wailed in the distance, and though it was headed somewhere else entirely, the sound made the young men jump. Thomas used that moment of distraction to his advantage, smoothly shifting the taxi into park while simultaneously reaching for something under his seat. "Time's up," he announced. "What's it going to be?" The tall one's facade of toughness cracked. In the span of a heartbeat, Thomas had produced what appeared to be a small black case, its contents unknown but its presence enough to make his would-be attackers reconsider their entire evening. "We were just playing around, man," the tall one said, his weapon now pointed at the floor. "No harm done, right?" Thomas's expression remained neutral, but his eyes were sharp as steel in the rearview mirror. "The weapon. Pass it forward." Slowly. His tone left no room for argument. There was a moment of hesitation, then the sound of metal sliding across leather as the tall one surrendered his weapon. Thomas secured it without taking his eyes off them, his movements precise and practiced. "Now, here's what's going to happen," Thomas began, his voice taking on the tone he'd used years ago when briefing teams before critical missions. "You're going to exit my taxi, one at a time. You're going to walk, not run, to the corner. Then you're going to go home and thank whatever you believe in that you met me tonight instead of someone less patient." The rain was pouring now, creating a curtain of water around the taxi. The young men looked at each other, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. One by one, they stepped out into the rain, their expensive clothes quickly becoming soaked. As the last one closed the door, Thomas rolled down his window. "One more thing," he called out to them. "I've got your faces memorized, your cologne brands noted, and enough friends in this city to know if you try something like this again. Don't." They nodded quickly before disappearing into the rain, looking much younger and smaller than they had when they'd first entered his taxi. Thomas waited until they were out of sight before allowing himself a long exhale. He placed the black case back under his seat. It had been empty the whole time, but they hadn't needed to know that. Picking up his radio, Thomas called in to dispatch. "Unit 247 here. Taking a short break due to weather conditions." He needed a moment to let the adrenaline subside, to push back the memories that nights like this always stirred up. As he sat there listening to the rain, Thomas thought about how different his life was now compared to his years in Special Forces. Back then, every day had been about survival, about protecting others, about making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. Now, he spent his days helping people get where they needed to go, listening to their stories, being a small part of their lives. But on nights like this, when the past came knocking, he was grateful for every lesson learned, every skill honed, every experience that had shaped him into who he was. The city lights flickered in the distance as the storm continued, and Thomas Johnson, taxi driver and former Special Forces operator, allowed himself a small smile. Those young men would never know how close they'd come to experiencing firsthand why his former team had nicknamed him, the Ghost. Some lessons, he thought, were better learned through fear than through pain. He put the taxi back in drive and headed toward the brighter parts of the city, leaving the darkness behind, for now. The storm had passed by the time Thomas pulled into Pete's All-Night Diner, a favorite haunt of city cab drivers. The neon sign buzzed quietly, casting a warm glow across the wet pavement. Inside, the familiar smell of coffee and grilled onions welcomed him like an old friend. "The usual, Thomas," called out Rita, the night shift waitress who'd been serving him coffee for the past decade. Her gray hair was tucked beneath a hairnet, and her eyes carried the wisdom of someone who'd heard 1,000 stories from behind that counter. "Thanks, Rita," he nodded, settling into his regular booth by the window. From here, he could watch both the street and the diner's entrance, old habits that had kept him alive through 2 decades of service. As Rita brought over his black coffee and a slice of apple pie, Thomas's phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but he recognized the area code immediately. It was from the region where he'd conducted his last mission before retiring from Special Forces. "Johnson," he answered, his voice automatically shifting back to its professional tone. "Ghost? Is that really you?" The voice on the other end belonged to Carlos Rodriguez, a former teammate he hadn't heard from in years. "Man, you're not an easy person to track down." Thomas took a sip of his coffee, memories flooding back of nights spent in foreign jungles with Carlos watching his back. "That's kind of the point, brother. What's going on?" There was a pause on the line, the kind that Thomas knew meant trouble was brewing. "We've got a situation," Carlos finally said. "Remember that operation in Bangkok? The one with the ambassador's daughter?" Thomas's hand tightened around his coffee cup. That mission had been one of their most dangerous, extracting the ambassador's daughter from a human trafficking ring that had connections reaching into the highest levels of several governments. "Hard to forget," he replied carefully. "Well, some of those connections we cut back then? They've reformed. And they're not just operating overseas anymore. They're here, in your city." Carlos's voice was grim. And worse, they know about you. The diner's fluorescent lights suddenly seemed too bright, too exposed. Thomas scanned the other patrons, a couple of truckers at the counter, a group of college students cramming for exams, an elderly man reading a newspaper. Nothing out of place, but now everything required scrutiny. How bad? Thomas asked, falling back into the clipped communication style of their operational days. Bad enough that I'm breaking protocol to warn you, Carlos replied. They found out about Bangkok. About what you did to their operation. They've been tracking down everyone involved in that mission. Johnson, they got to Mike last week. Mike Chen had been their communications expert, a genius with technology and one of the kindest souls Thomas had ever known. The thought of him being targeted made Thomas's blood run cold. His family? Thomas asked, already dreading the answer. Safe. We got them out in time. But Mike? Carlos's voice cracked slightly. He went down fighting, brother. Took 3 of them with him. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, offering a silent prayer for his fallen friend. When he opened them, Rita was watching him with concern from behind the counter. He gave her a reassuring nod, but his mind was already racing through scenarios and contingencies. They'll come for you next, Carlos continued. These people, they're not just criminals anymore. They've evolved. Got legitimate businesses as fronts, political connections, everything. And they've hired some serious talent, ex-military, former intelligence operators. They're looking for payback, and they've got the resources to make it happen. Thomas thought about his quiet life as a taxi driver, about the peace he'd found in the simple act of helping people get where they needed to go. But he also thought about Mike, about the innocent lives these people had destroyed, about the evil they represented. Send me what you've got, Thomas said, his decision made. Names, locations, everything. Already done. Check your secure email. Carlos paused again. Ghost, you don't have to do this alone. I can be there in 18 hours. Thomas looked at his reflection in the diner window, seeing not the gray-haired taxi driver but the warrior he'd once been, and in many ways, still was. No, you need to stay with Mike's family. Make sure they stay safe. I've got some contacts here in the city, people who owe me favors. Watch your back, brother, Carlos warned. These guys, they're not like the thugs you usually deal with. They're professionals. Thomas allowed himself a small smile. So am I, Carlos. So am I. After ending the call, Thomas sat in the booth for a long while, plotting his next moves. The city outside was starting to wake up, the first hints of dawn painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. Regular people were heading to regular jobs, unaware of the shadow war that was about to unfold in their midst. Rita came over with a coffee refill, studying his face with motherly concern. Everything okay, Thomas? You look like you've seen a ghost. Just some old memories, Rita, he replied, managing a warm smile. Sometimes the past has a way of catching up with you. As he left the diner, Thomas knew his life as a simple taxi driver was about to become considerably more complicated. The skills he'd hoped to never use again would need to be sharpened. The networks he'd built over years of driving the city streets would need to be activated. And the warrior he'd tried to leave behind would need to emerge once more. The young thugs from earlier that night had been right about one thing: they really hadn't known who they were dealing with. Soon, a lot of other people would make the same discovery. Thomas, the Ghost, Johnson was about to remind the world why he'd earned that nickname, and this time, it wasn't just about survival, it was about justice. Thomas's apartment was exactly as he'd left it, but it no longer felt like the sanctuary it had been just hours ago. The morning light filtered through his blinds as he sat at his small kitchen table, studying the information Carlos had sent. His laptop screen glowed with faces and locations, each representing a piece of the puzzle he needed to solve. The trafficking ring they destroyed in Bangkok had indeed reformed, but with a sophisticated new structure. They'd learned from their past mistakes, operating behind layers of legitimate businesses, import companies, tech startups, even a chain of high-end restaurants. At the center of it all was a name Thomas remembered all too well, Victor Chen, no relation to Mike, but a man whose cruelty had left deep scars in Thomas's memory. A knock at his door made him instinctively reach for the weapon he kept hidden under the table. Through his security camera feed, he saw his neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who often brought him homemade cookies. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," he said, opening the door while keeping his body positioned defensively, another old habit. "Thomas, dear. I made too many snickerdoodles again," she smiled, holding out a plate of cookies. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she noticed his tension. "Are you all right? You look like you haven't slept." "Just a long night shift," he replied, accepting the cookies with genuine gratitude. Mrs. Thompson reminded him of why he'd chosen this life, the simple kindness of ordinary people living ordinary lives. After she left, Thomas returned to his research. He'd need help, but not from his old military contacts. Over the years of driving his taxi, he'd built a different kind of network, one that saw everything but stayed invisible. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he rarely used. After 3 rings, a gruff voice answered, "Jimmy's Auto Shop." "Hey, Jimmy. It's Thomas. Remember that transmission you helped me with last year? I could use another favor." Jimmy's voice immediately turned serious. "Thomas? Man, I was about to call you. Some guys were asking about you yesterday. Real professional types, if you know what I mean. Expensive suits, but they moved like soldiers." Thomas's jaw tightened. They were moving faster than he'd expected. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing useful. Said you were just another cab driver who comes in for repairs." "But Thomas, they didn't believe me. Left their card, said there'd be good money if I called them when you showed up." "Keep their card," Thomas instructed. "If they come back, act nervous, like you're hiding something. Let them think they're intimidating you." "Can you do that?" "Sure, but what's this about? The less you know, the safer you are." "But Jimmy, I might need to borrow your back room for a while." There was a pause on the line. "It's yours." "And Thomas? The guys in my shop, they haven't forgotten what you did for us during the strike last year. You need anything, just say the word." After ending the call, Thomas opened a hidden panel in his closet. Inside was a steel case he hadn't touched in years. The combination lock clicked open to reveal his old field kit, specialized equipment from his Special Forces days that he'd never been able to bring himself to dispose of. As he checked each item, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, "Ghost, package at usual drop." Time sensitive. Hawk was Linda Chen, Mike's widow and a former intelligence analyst. If she was reaching out, the situation was even more serious than he'd thought. Thomas grabbed his taxi keys and headed out. The morning rush hour was in full swing, providing perfect cover for what he needed to do. He drove his regular route, picking up and dropping off passengers as if it were any other day. But his eyes constantly scanned for tails, his mind noting every suspicious vehicle or person. The usual drop was a storage locker at the central train station. Thomas parked his taxi in the underground garage and made his way to the locker, using every counter-surveillance technique he'd ever learned. The station was crowded with commuters, each face a potential threat, each shadow a possible ambush point. The locker contained a single USB drive and a handwritten note, "They have a list. You're not the only one. Watch for the white orchid." Thomas's blood ran cold. The white orchid had been the symbol of the trafficking ring in Bangkok, their calling card left at crime scenes. If they were using it again, they weren't just seeking revenge, they were rebuilding their entire operation. Back in his taxi, Thomas began piecing together the puzzle. The thugs who tried to rob him last night hadn't been random criminals, they'd been a test, probably sent to assess his capabilities. The questions at Jimmy's shop weren't about finding him, they were about establishing his routine, his connections. His radio crackled with a dispatch call for a pickup at the Golden Dragon restaurant, one of the businesses he'd identified in Carlos's files as a potential front. It wasn't a coincidence. Thomas accepted the fare. If they wanted to play this game, he'd play. But this time, he'd set the rules. He pulled into a side alley and opened his trunk, quickly making some modifications to his taxi's interior. To any observer, it would look completely normal, but he'd learned long ago that the best weapons were the ones nobody saw coming. As he drove toward the Golden Dragon, Thomas thought about Mrs. Thompson's cookies, about Rita's coffee at the diner, about Jimmy's loyalty. He'd built a life here, a real one, with people who depended on him. He couldn't run, couldn't hide. This time, he would have to fight, not just for survival, but for everything and everyone he'd come to care about. The Golden Dragon's neon sign glowed in the distance, a beacon drawing him toward what he knew would be the first real confrontation. Thomas adjusted his rearview mirror, checked his weapon, and allowed himself a grim smile. They thought they were hunting him, but they'd forgotten the first rule of hunting ghosts: sometimes, the ghost hunts back. The Golden Dragon restaurant stood like a gaudy sentinel in the fading afternoon light, its red and gold facade masking darker purposes within. Thomas parked his taxi in front, taking note of the black SUV with tinted windows in the side alley and the security camera angles covering the entrance. Two men in suits stood by the door, their stances betraying their military background to his trained eye. His radio crackled. "Unit 247, your pickup is waiting inside. Customer name, Mr. White." The dispatcher's voice gave no indication that anything was amiss, but Thomas knew better. White had been Victor Chen's code name during the Bangkok operation. "Copy that, dispatch," Thomas responded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his system. He stepped out of his taxi, adjusting his jacket to better conceal the modifications he'd made to his clothing. Years of experience had taught him that the best armor wasn't always Kevlar, sometimes it was just looking like you belonged. The suited men at the door gave him a cursory glance as he walked past, but Thomas caught the slight hand movements that suggested they were reporting his arrival through concealed earpieces. Inside, the restaurant was surprisingly busy for mid-afternoon, filled with what appeared to be legitimate customers enjoying late lunches. A hostess approached him, her smile professional but her eyes sharp. "You must be the taxi driver," she said, her accent precisely cultivated. "Mr. White is waiting in the private dining room. Please, follow me." Thomas followed her through the main dining area, mentally mapping exit routes and noting the positions of what he estimated to be at least 6 more security personnel disguised as waiters and busboys. The private dining room was located at the back of the restaurant, accessed through a corridor lined with ornate Chinese artwork. "Right through here," the hostess gestured to a lacquered door decorated with white orchids. "Of course." The private room was dimly lit, dominated by a large round table where 3 people sat, 2 men in expensive suits, and a woman whose elegant appearance couldn't quite hide the predatory gleam in her eyes. Thomas recognized her immediately, Anna Kovalev, Victor Chen's second-in-command from Bangkok. She hadn't aged a day in 15 years. "Ah, the famous ghost," Anna smiled, her Russian accent as thick as he remembered. "Or should I say, Thomas Johnson, humble taxi driver. Please, sit. We have much to discuss." Thomas remained standing, positioning himself so he could see both the door and the large mirror on the wall that he suspected was one-way glass. "I charge by the minute," he said mildly. "The meter's running." Anna laughed, a sound as artificial as her pleasant demeanor. "Still the professional, I see. Very well, let's talk business." She gestured to one of the suited men, who placed a tablet on the table. We've been watching you, Thomas. You've built quite a life here. Simple. Quiet. Almost peaceful. Her smile turned cold. It would be a shame if anything were to happen to it. The tablet displayed images that made Thomas's jaw clench: Mrs. Thompson watering her plants, Rita serving coffee at the diner, Jimmy working in his shop. All taken within the last 24 hours. Victor sends his regards, Anna continued. He wanted to be here himself, but business in Bangkok required his personal attention. He hasn't forgotten what you did to his organization. The millions in lost revenue, the damaged relationships, the years spent rebuilding. She leaned forward. But he's also a businessman. He sees potential in every situation, even one as complicated as this. If this is a job offer, I'm not interested, Thomas replied, his voice level. And if it's a threat, you should know I don't respond well to those. The second suited man shifted slightly, his hand moving toward his jacket. Anna waved him down. Not a threat, Thomas. An opportunity. Victor is expanding his operations, and he needs people with your particular skill set. Your knowledge of the city, your connections, your ability to move unnoticed, these are valuable assets. Thomas allowed himself a small smile. You're right about one thing, he said. I do know this city. He paused, letting his words hang in the air. I know, for instance, that the health department is conducting surprise inspections this week. In fact, they're probably walking through the front door right now. Anna's eyes widened slightly as commotion erupted from the main dining room. Through the door, they could hear authoritative voices announcing a health inspection, followed by the sound of customers being asked to leave. A simple phone call, Thomas explained. You've been watching me, but I've been watching you too. That SUV in the alley? It's being towed as we speak. Those security cameras you relied on? They've been looping old footage for the past 10 minutes. And your men by the door? They're currently busy explaining to actual health inspectors why they're carrying concealed weapons in a restaurant. Anna's pleasant mask cracked, revealing the anger beneath. You have no idea what you're doing, she hissed. We are not the same organization you dealt with in Bangkok. We have reach you can't imagine. You're right again, Thomas nodded. You're not the same organization. You're sloppier. 15 years ago, you would never have been so obvious with your surveillance. You wouldn't have tried to intimidate me in broad daylight. And you certainly wouldn't have let me walk in here with this. He pulled out his phone, showing them the screen. A red dot blinked steadily. That's a live feed, broadcasting everything that's happened in this room to some very interested parties. Former colleagues of mine who've been looking for a direct connection between the Golden Dragon and your operation. The suited men reached for their weapons, but Thomas was already moving. In one fluid motion, he flipped the heavy table onto its side, sending dishes crashing to the floor. The lights went out, courtesy of Jimmy's people at the electrical station, plunging the room into chaos. What happened next would later be pieced together from security footage and witness statements, but in the moment, it was exactly why Thomas had earned the nickname Ghost. By the time the emergency lights came on, he was gone, leaving behind two unconscious security men and a very frustrated Anna Kovalev. But Thomas wasn't running away. As he slipped through the kitchen's back exit, he knew this was just the opening move in a much larger game. He'd shown them he wouldn't be intimidated, but he'd also learned something crucial: their organization was vulnerable. They'd grown too fast, become too confident. Back in his taxi, Thomas picked up his radio. Dispatch, Unit 247 here. Taking my break early today. He pulled away from the Golden Dragon just as police cars began arriving, their sirens adding to the chaos he'd created. His phone buzzed with a text from Linda, feed received. Moving to Phase 2. Stay safe, Ghost. Thomas allowed himself a grim smile. The real work was just beginning, and this time, he wasn't fighting alone. The basement of Jimmy's auto shop had transformed into an improvised command center. Computer monitors lined one wall, displaying surveillance feeds from across the city. Thomas sat at a makeshift desk, studying financial records Linda had sent him, while Jimmy kept watch upstairs in the legitimate business. "You're not going to like this," Linda's voice crackled through the secure laptop connection. Her face on the screen looked tired, but her eyes were sharp with purpose. "I've been analyzing the data from the Golden Dragon operation. They're planning something big, Thomas. Really big." Thomas leaned forward, rubbing his temples. He'd been awake for nearly 30 hours, running on coffee and determination. "Tell me." "They're not just rebuilding their trafficking operation. They're using it as cover for something else." Linda's fingers flew across her keyboard, sending new documents to Thomas's screen. "Look at these shipping manifests. The patterns don't match typical human trafficking routes." Thomas studied the documents, his years of experience helping him see the hidden meaning in the seemingly random data. "They're moving weapons," he said finally. "Using the same routes they once used for human trafficking." "Not just any weapons," Linda corrected. "Remember those experimental prototype designs that went missing from the military research facility last year? The ones that were supposed to be impossible to steal?" Thomas felt his stomach drop. "Victor Chen has them? Worse. He's improved them. And according to these schedules, the first major shipment arrives at the port tomorrow night." Linda's voice was grim. "If these weapons hit the streets..." "They won't," Thomas interrupted. He pulled up a map of the city's port area on another monitor. "Send me everything you have on the shipment. Dock numbers, container information, security rotations." A knock on the basement door made Thomas instantly reach for his weapon, but the pattern was familiar, Jimmy's warning signal. Moments later, the auto shop owner hurried down the stairs. "Thomas, you need to see this," Jimmy said, turning on the small TV in the corner. The local news was running a breaking story. 3 bodies had been found in the river, all former dock workers who'd recently been fired from their jobs at the port. "They're cleaning house," Thomas muttered. "Removing anyone who might talk about their operation." He turned back to Linda's feed. "How many more dock workers were fired in the last month?" Linda's fingers flew across her keyboard again. 7. "And I'm sending you their addresses now. If Chen's people are eliminating witnesses, we need to get to them first," Thomas finished. He stood, checking his equipment. "Jimmy, I need you to reach out to your union contacts. Get word to those workers, they need to disappear for a few days." Jimmy nodded. "I'll call in some favors. Got some safe houses from the last strike that nobody knows about." "Linda, keep digging. Focus on the Port Authority personnel. Chen must have people on the inside to pull this off." Thomas strapped on his concealed body armor, carefully hidden under his taxi driver's uniform. "What about Anna?" Linda asked. "After your stunt at the Golden Dragon, she'll be expecting you to make a move." Thomas allowed himself a small smile. "That's exactly what I want. While she's watching for me, she won't notice what's happening right under her nose." He turned to Jimmy. "Is everything ready upstairs?" Jimmy grinned. "Just like you asked. Man, those guys aren't going to know what hit them." Thomas checked his watch. The afternoon rush hour was just beginning, perfect timing for what he had planned. He'd spent years learning the rhythms of the city, how traffic flowed, where people gathered. Now he'd use that knowledge for more than just finding the quickest route across town. "Linda, send an anonymous tip to your contact at the Port Authority. Tell them to expect increased activity around Dock 27 tonight. That should keep Chen's people busy in the wrong place." Thomas pulled up another map on his phone, this one showing the city's underground tunnel system, a relic from Prohibition days that most people had forgotten about. "What about Mike's family?" Linda asked softly. "They're still asking questions about his death. They deserve to know the truth." Thomas paused, memories of his fallen friend weighing heavily on his mind. "When this is over," he promised. "But right now, the best way to honor Mike is to finish what we started in Bangkok. We shut them down once, we can do it again." An alert beeped on one of the monitors. Facial recognition had picked up one of Chen's known associates entering a high-end hotel downtown. Thomas studied the image, recognizing the man as one of Victor Chen's most trusted lieutenants. "They're gathering," he observed. "Probably planning their response to the Golden Dragon incident." "Thomas," Linda's voice was hesitant. "There's something else you should know. I found a connection between Chen's operation and someone in local law enforcement. Someone high up." The pieces suddenly clicked into place. "The commissioner," Thomas said. "That's how they've been staying ahead of investigations. Why certain evidence keeps disappearing." Jimmy whistled low. "Man, you sure know how to pick your enemies." "Not enemies," Thomas corrected, checking his equipment one final time. "Just people who haven't learned their lesson yet." He headed for the stairs, his mind already mapping out the next phase of his plan. "Ghost," Linda called after him. "Be careful. These people, they're desperate now. And desperate people make mistakes." "That's what I'm counting on," Thomas replied. "When people get desperate, they get sloppy. And when they get sloppy..." He let the sentence hang in the air. Back in his taxi, Thomas merged into the afternoon traffic, just another yellow cab in a sea of vehicles. But beneath the ordinary exterior, both car and driver were prepared for what was coming. He'd modified the taxi's frame to conceal equipment, added reinforced panels, and installed a few surprises that would only become apparent when needed. His radio crackled with a familiar voice, dispatch calling with another pickup request. But this time, the location made him smile. It was exactly where he expected Chen's people to set their trap. "Unit 247 responding," he said into the radio. "On my way." As he drove, Thomas thought about all the pieces in play: Jimmy's union contacts spreading the word among the dock workers, Linda's digital surveillance net tightening around Chen's operation, and the corrupt officials who thought their positions made them untouchable. They had no idea what was coming. After all, the best way to spring a trap was to make your enemies think they were the ones setting it. And Thomas, the Ghost Johnson, had learned long ago that sometimes the most effective weapon wasn't a gun or a knife, it was making your opponents defeat themselves. The evening sky had turned a deep purple as Thomas's taxi wound through the warehouse district. The pickup location was an abandoned textile factory, a perfect ambush site, which was exactly why he'd chosen it. What Chen's people didn't know was that they were walking into a trap of his own design. His earpiece crackled with Linda's voice. "Security cameras show 8 men inside the factory. They're trying to look casual, but they're definitely military trained. Armed too, based on their movements." "Any sign of Anna?" Thomas asked, smoothly turning onto the factory's access road. "Negative. But I've got eyes on that black SUV from the Golden Dragon. It's parked 2 blocks away, engine running." Linda paused. "Thomas, something feels off about this. It's too easy to spot them." "That's because they want to be spotted," Thomas replied, pulling up to the factory's main entrance. "They're not trying to hide, they're trying to direct me exactly where they want me to go." He stepped out of his taxi, making a show of checking the address on his phone like any ordinary cab driver would. The factory loomed before him, its broken windows staring down like empty eyes. The whole scene was staged to intimidate, to make him feel trapped and outnumbered. "Jimmy, you in position?" Thomas murmured into his concealed mic. "Roger that," came the reply. "My guys are ready. Just give the signal." Thomas approached the factory entrance, his posture relaxed but his senses on high alert. The heavy metal door creaked open at his touch, recently oiled hinges, he noted. They'd prepared this place carefully. Inside, the factory floor was a maze of old machinery and support columns. Dim light filtered through the dirty windows, creating deep shadows perfect for concealment. Thomas could feel eyes on him from multiple directions. "Your fare's waiting upstairs, driver," a voice called from the darkness. "Second floor office." "Meters running," Thomas called back, heading for the stairs. He counted footsteps in the shadows, 3 men following him, 2 more moving to block the exit, several others maintaining positions upstairs. All according to plan. The second-floor office had once belonged to the factory manager, its large windows offering a commanding view of the floor below. As Thomas entered, he found exactly who he expected, Commissioner David Harrison, the man who'd been protecting Chen's operation from law enforcement scrutiny. "Mr. Johnson," Harrison said, standing behind a dusty desk. "Or do you prefer, Ghost? Please, have a seat." He gestured to a chair positioned in the center of the room, a vulnerable position with no cover. Thomas remained standing. "I'll keep this brief, Commissioner. Meters running, remember?" Harrison's attempted smile didn't reach his eyes. "Always the professional. That's what Chen admired about you, you know. Even in Bangkok, when you tore apart his operation, you did it with style." He moved around the desk. "That's why he wanted to offer you a chance to be reasonable before things got messy." "Reasonable?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Like those dock workers you had killed?" "Necessary sacrifices for a greater purpose," Harrison replied smoothly. "You're a military man, Johnson. You understand that sometimes difficult decisions must be made." "What I understand," Thomas said, "is that you're helping traffic weapons that could kill thousands of innocent people. That's not a difficult decision, that's just wrong." Harrison's facade of civility cracked slightly. "Wrong? Do you know what's wrong? Spending 30 years in law enforcement, watching criminals walk free because of technicalities, because of rules and regulations that protect the guilty while the innocent suffer." His voice rose with genuine emotion. Chen offered a solution. "His weapons will go to the right people, people who'll use them to restore order." "You actually believe that?" Thomas said quietly. "You really think Chen cares about order? About justice? He's using you, Commissioner. Just like he uses everyone." A new voice joined the conversation, Anna Kovalev, stepping out from a side room. "Perhaps it's time we showed Mr. Johnson exactly what these weapons can do." She held what looked like an ordinary handgun, but Thomas recognized the advanced targeting system integrated into its design. "The prototype," he said. "That's what this is really about. You're not just selling weapons, you're demonstrating them. Using my city as a testing ground." Anna smiled. "Very good, Ghost. Always so perceptive. Yes, tonight's demonstration will prove to our buyers that our weapons work exactly as promised. And you." She raised the prototype, aiming it at Thomas's chest. "You will help us demonstrate their effectiveness." That's when all hell broke loose. The factory's power went out, plunging the room into darkness. But instead of the expected chaos, a series of precise events unfolded, events Thomas had carefully orchestrated over the past 24 hours. Jimmy's union workers, positioned in buildings across the street, activated powerful industrial spotlights, illuminating the factory's windows from multiple angles. The sudden brightness blinded Chen's men, who had been watching for movement in the darkness. Simultaneously, Linda activated the signal jammers Thomas had planted earlier, cutting off all communication between Harrison's corrupt officers waiting outside and their teams within the factory. The carefully coordinated ambush fell apart as their tactical advantage disappeared. "Now that," Thomas said calmly, "is what proper planning looks like. Before Anna could fire the prototype weapon, Thomas had already moved. The chair she'd wanted him to sit in crashed through the window, triggering the fire suppression system. Water rained down throughout the building, but it wasn't just water. Thomas had added a special compound that made the prototype's advanced targeting system useless. Ghost! Anna screamed in frustration, but Thomas was already gone, seeming to vanish between one moment and the next, living up to his nickname. Harrison reached for his phone, but found himself staring at a screen full of evidence, papers, photos, and recordings showing his connection to Chen's operation. How? Linda says hello, Thomas's voice echoed from somewhere in the darkness. She's been busy backing up all your deleted files. Amazing what people keep on their phones these days. The sound of sirens filled the air, not Harrison's corrupt officers, but federal agents Linda had contacted. They'd been waiting for exactly this kind of proof to move against the commissioner. As chaos erupted throughout the factory, Thomas made his way back to his taxi, pausing only to ensure that the prototype weapon was secured. Another piece of Chen's operation dismantled, another step closer to finishing what had started in Bangkok. His phone buzzed with a message from Linda. Port Authority just found the real weapons shipment. Chen's people never saw us coming. Good work, Ghost. Thomas allowed himself a small smile as he drove away from the factory. In his rearview mirror, he could see federal agents leading Harrison away in handcuffs while Anna Kovalev was nowhere to be seen. She'd slipped away in the chaos, just as he'd expected she would. But that was fine. She'd run straight back to Chen, carrying news of their failure. And Chen, true to his nature, would become angry. Reckless. Ready to make mistakes. The night wasn't over yet, and Thomas, the Ghost, Johnson still had work to do. Dawn was breaking over the city as Thomas's taxi pulled into the private airport on the outskirts of town. Linda's intelligence had been perfect. Victor Chen was trying to flee the country after learning about the factory raid and the failed weapons demonstration. But he wouldn't escape. Not this time. Target confirmed, Linda's voice came through his earpiece. Chen's private jet is fueled and ready on runway 3. He's expected to arrive in 15 minutes. Thomas parked his taxi in the short-term lot, perfectly positioned to observe the private terminal's entrance. Anna? Already inside. She arrived 10 minutes ago with 4 guards. They're trying to secure the area, but they're nervous. The factory incident has them spooked. A slight smile crossed Thomas's face. Everything was proceeding exactly as he'd predicted. Chen's organization was unraveling, the weapons seizure, Harrison's arrest, the failed ambush, each setback adding to their desperation. And desperate people made mistakes. Jimmy's crews are in position, Linda continued. They've got the access roads covered. Chen's not getting out that way if things go wrong. Thomas checked his equipment one last time. And Mike's family? Safe. I've got them on a secure line watching everything. They'll see Chen answer for what he did. A black limousine appeared at the terminal's entrance. Thomas watched through high-powered binoculars as Victor Chen stepped out, looking nothing like the powerful crime lord he'd been just days ago. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his movements hurried and paranoid. Ghost, Linda's voice carried a note of warning. We've got movement on the thermal cameras. More of Chen's men hiding in the maintenance buildings. At least 8 armed guards we didn't know about. Good, Thomas replied calmly. That means they're exactly where I want them. He stepped out of his taxi, straightening his driver's uniform. To anyone watching, he looked like just another cab driver finishing a late-night airport run. But beneath that ordinary exterior, every step was calculated, every movement purposeful. Inside the terminal, Anna was arguing with Chen in hushed but heated tones. Thomas didn't need to hear their words to know what was happening. The organization was fracturing, trust breaking down as failure bred suspicion. It's over, Victor, Thomas called out, his voice carrying across the quiet terminal. Chen spun around, his face contorting with rage when he recognized Thomas. Ghost. I should have known you wouldn't let it end quietly. He snapped his fingers, and armed men emerged from their hiding spots, weapons trained on Thomas. You're right, Thomas agreed, continuing to walk forward casually. I couldn't let it end quietly. Not after Mike. Not after those dock workers. Not after everything you've done. I've done? Chen laughed bitterly. I created order from chaos. I built an empire that spanned continents. Who are you to judge me? A taxi driver? A relic from a forgotten operation? No, Thomas shook his head. I'm the ghost that's been haunting you for 15 years. The one who showed the world who you really are, not an emperor, just a thug who preys on the innocent. Chen's composure cracked. Kill him, he screamed at his men. Kill him now. But nothing happened. One by one, Chen's guards lowered their weapons. Behind them, federal agents emerged from hiding, their own weapons ready. Jimmy's union workers had blocked every exit. Linda's surveillance had mapped every escape route. Your men are tired, Victor, Thomas said softly. Tired of running. Tired of living in fear. They've seen what happened to Harrison, to your operation. They know it's over. Anna raised her weapon, the last one still standing by Chen's side. But her hands were shaking. We can still fight our way out, she insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. Anna, Thomas looked at her with something close to pity. Mike's family is watching. They deserve to see justice done the right way. Her weapon clattered to the floor. Chen made a final, desperate lunge toward the terminal doors, but Thomas was already there, moving with the fluid grace that had earned him his nickname. In one smooth motion, he had Chen pinned, arms locked behind his back. Bangkok sends its regards, Thomas whispered as federal agents moved in to make the arrest. Hours later, Thomas sat in Pete's all-night diner, watching the sunrise through the window of his regular booth. The news was playing on the diner's small TV, showing footage of Chen and his associates being led away in handcuffs. The headline scrolled across the bottom, International Weapons Ring Dismantled, Corrupt Officials Arrested. Rita brought him his usual coffee and apple pie. Quite a story, she said, nodding at the TV. Hard to believe all that was happening in our city. Thomas smiled tiredly. Sometimes the biggest stories are hiding in plain sight. His phone buzzed with a message from Linda. Mike's family sends their thanks. They can rest easier now. Another message followed, this one from Jimmy. Union boys are calling you a hero. Don't let it go to your head. Thomas chuckled softly, then picked up his radio. Dispatch, Unit 247 here. Ready for my next fare. Copy that, 247, the dispatcher replied. Got a pickup on 5th and Main. As Thomas drove through the awakening city, he reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. Chen's organization was destroyed, his weapons would never reach the streets, and corrupt officials would face justice. But more importantly, the city itself remained unchanged, people going about their lives, unaware of the shadow war that had been fought to keep them safe. A young woman flagged down his taxi on 5th Street, looking tired after a long night shift. Thank you for stopping, she said, sliding into the back seat. It's been impossible to get a cab this morning. No problem, Thomas replied, turning the meter on. Where to? As she gave him an address in the suburbs, Thomas caught her eye in the rearview mirror and smiled. This was why he'd chosen this life after leaving the service, not for the excitement or the danger, but for these simple moments of helping people get where they needed to go. The ghost could rest now. Thomas Johnson, taxi driver, had fares to collect. But he kept his skills sharp, his senses alert, and his network active. Because in this city, you never knew when someone might need a hero disguised as a taxi driver. As his cab disappeared into the morning traffic, it became just another yellow taxi in a sea of vehicles. But those who knew, truly knew, understood that somewhere out there, the ghost was still watching, still protecting, still serving in his own quiet way. And if trouble ever came calling again, they knew exactly which taxi to call.